Hello again. All right. Well, as I was just saying in the last lecture, um, there's very much a sense within this that the diversity and variety within this thinking can almost be confounding. But you know what? In a way, I actually find it very liberating too, and I'll tell you why. It's because as much as this stuff is locked in a culture that's very far away, in a time that's long since passed, these ideas are discussed in a way that are not meant simply to apply to people living in a certain time and place. As a matter of fact, they're wrapped up in themes that seem to deal with general human problems. And let me tell you three of the themes that I tend to draw out from this tradition. The themes that I draw out are the theme of the problem of ignorance, the theme of the problem of finitude, finiteness, limitation, if you like, and the problem of suffering. Let me tell you what I mean. Let's first to the problem of ignorance. Well, as you probably noticed, there's a lot to know in the world. And thankfully, we have minds that allow us to continue knowing and continue knowing and continue knowing. Even when we forget things, we can continue knowing. At least we can know we forgot, right? We can always acquire more things. But there's one problem, and the problem is that while we can come to know more and more specific things, there's always a sense in which we're aware that whatever it is we know has some sort of condition that we're simply taking for granted. And this condition that makes it possible for a thing to be known, for anything to stand or exist, be the way it is, for anything to have the meaning that it does, this is something that we almost have to have some ignorance of in order to grasp things. Why do we have to have this ignorance? Why is it that whatever we know, we only know partially, and that this is the way to know things? Well, this brings me to the second problem of finitude, limitation. You see, as you've probably noticed, in being who you are, in your mind or consciousness acting the way it does, having the intention that it does, focusing on the way it does, thinking the way it does, you know what it has? It has limits, it has boundaries, it has borders, it has a this and a that, a here and a there, an is and is not, all this stuff, right? This is the way in which we make sense out of things. This is how we form and delineate concepts. It's the way in which we think. And that's great because it does allow us to organize. It allows us to point, to operate, to conceptualize the way we do in the world. I mean, think about it. That's how crucial that is for concepts functioning in your mind, is that they have limits and that they can be distinguished from one another. But there's a problem with that too. And the problem is that while that allows us to function, it never allows us to know the condition for the possibility of functioning, does it? It never allows us to know the ground upon which the very ideas stand and are made possible. And I mean, it doesn't allow us to know it at all. It allows us to know that it is, but not what it is. So that we're stuck in this problem of ignorance, where knowing is always knowing partially. And why is knowing partially? Because of the fact that we know in a finite way, that we exist and be and mean in a finite way in terms of limits. And this brings me to the third problem of suffering. Now this word suffering, this is going to come up again and again and again. This is a big issue in the Brahmanical thought, and it's going to be an even bigger issue when we get to the to the Buddhist thought. The word for suffering, the main word for suffering in Sanskrit, the language that all this stuff is done in, is dukkha. Dukkha. I'll probably write it up on some of the blackboard sometime. You can get a chance to see it, and I think it's written in here some in the Upanishads. But what I want to get across is that within this tradition, just like within Buddhism, suffering doesn't just have to do with pain. It's possible to feel pain and not necessarily to suffer, like when an athlete wins a race or something like that. And it's possible to suffer and not necessarily feel pain. Suffering has more to do with an uneasiness, a sense of incompletion, a sense of that I can't be standing still or steady or even or clear-minded. The water that has to flow out of the bucket because it tips, the stone that has to roll down the hill because it's set precariously over its edge. This is the state that our minds and our bodies and our being is in. It can never simply be as it is. It can never be complete in terms of what it is because it's always aware of its limitations. It's always aware of its incompleteness. And this is the way in which we frame our lives, in which we organize our being, in which we live and find meaning in our existence. To exist is to be permeated with this suffering, a suffering that arises from our within this tradition, which arises from our limits and which arises from our ignorance. It is to overcome this, to be able to deal with these problems, to be able to deal with the persistence of suffering, the persistence of ignorance, the reiteration of these problems, that this system is, that this approach, this cosmology, this view of the world is trying to deal with things. Now, how does it go about doing it? Well, I would lift up four, if you like, directions that it comes from. The first that you're going to see in a number of places is it's profoundly analytical. It breaks things down into their component parts, tries to say what they fundamentally are, and then build them back up in different ways. This is less pronounced in the Upanishads, which sounds a little more mystical, but it's still there. The elements are certainly there. And you're definitely going to see as you think through this stuff that it requires analysis, probably a lot more analysis than in the Chinese thought, which seems to operate on a more aesthetic bent. But there is an aesthetic bent to Indian thought as well, Brahmanical thought, and that's actually the second thing I would bring up. Aesthetic here isn't just a study of beauty. I mean aesthetic in the sense of feeling, sensing, knowing by virtue of encountering it through our bodies, through our senses, and then knowing it in that way. Knowing action by virtue of being able to feel it or sense it or taste it or touch it or smell it or imagine it, right? This is aesthetic. To participate it with the senses in the fullest sense of that word. That's aesthetic. A third way in which we come to know and deal with these problems of ignorance, of finitude, and of suffering, to try to deal with them, overcome them within this tradition, is through devotion. And I mean religious devotion here. The term that gets used in Sanskrit is a term called bhakti. Bhakti. And it's a term that doesn't just mean devotion like I'm really committed to a devotion. It's not, even the word faith doesn't quite get to it. It's more of a wholly giving oneself over to something, usually in the sense of something greater than oneself, fuller than oneself, deeper than oneself, though itself perhaps limited. This is where you get the deep, deep, deep religious sensibilities that come out in the Upanishads and within the Hindu tradition. It's going to seem sometimes, I should say right now too, a little like a contradiction, in which they're going to be mentioning gods all the time, and yet there is this condition that makes it possible for gods to be godlike at all. This term that I'll talk about, Brahman, the absolute, the one without a second, and its synonymous counterpart, Atman, the true self, not an inner self, but the true self, the ground for the possibility of selfhood at all. There's going to be this weird back and forth in which it'll seem you'll read on one hand devotion, giving oneself over to gods or to God, in the last Upanishad that you'll read, and on the other hand, this discussion about Brahman, conditionlessness, one without a second. But the place it's brought together is recognizing that this role of devotion has to do with a kind of exercise, a kind of giving over, a way of trying to deal with the limits that I had talked about of ignorance, of finitude, and of suffering. So you have an analytical approach, you have an aesthetic approach, you have a devotional approach. And then finally, I guess the last thing I would bring up is an approach, I don't know if there's a word for it that's really very good in English, but the one I would switch towards would be a mindful approach, or perhaps a phenomenological approach. This is an approach that has to do with turning inward to the activities, not just of the mind, but of consciousness itself, and trying to bring it to a point where it reflects its own nature, where it reaches a certain degree of clarity, of translucence, so that rather than grasping and generating illusions by its ignorance, by its needs, by its wants, it can bring itself to a place where it is entirely clear to its own nature, and one realizes that everything that is in fact an expression and interdependent with the one, the you, just as you are an expression of and interdependent with everything else. So these are some ways in which to approach it. And now I shall probably move on and say a little bit about some of the specific terms that we encounter within the Upanishads and within this tradition in general.